At the far edge of a misty cornfield, where the stalks swayed like tired sentinels under the breath of an October wind, something unexpected broke the calm of morning. A battered young woman lay hidden in the weeds, her torn black shirt clinging. To bruised skin, her face pale and swollen, her breath thin as if the air itself no longer wished to stay inside her. Beside her, bundled only in a frayed blanket too light for the season, a 5-month-old baby whimpered weakly, the sound cutting through the silence like a fragile thread. The child's cry was not strong. It carried more exhaustion than protest, as though the night had drained nearly everything from his small body. It was there, in that forgotten ditch, that two sisters stumbled upon a sight that would change their mourning and their lives. Lydia and Clara, just 8 years old, were walking hand in hand with baskets swinging from their arms, their German shepherd padding steadily by their side. They were twins, inseparable, and though they looked so much alike that neighbors often confused them, their hearts carried different rhythms. Lydia's voice always came first, quick and sure, while Clara's eyes saw the quiet details others might pass by. That morning, they had set out like they often did, expecting nothing more than chores, laughter, and the steady watch of their dog. But life had prepared something heavier. Thor, the shepherd, stopped suddenly. His body went rigid, ears pricking toward the unseen. The twins froze, sensing what he did. Then as the dog lunged forward with a sharp bark, not playful but urgent, they followed without question, boots pounding the dirt path. The world around them seemed to hush. The crows stilled their chatter, the wind curled low through the stalks, and every sound narrowed into the rapid beat of two small hearts. At the ditch, the truth revealed itself. A figure lay half-hidden in cattails and damp brush. At first, Lydia thought it was discarded fabric or some scarecrow caught in the weeds. But as she stepped closer, the shape resolved into the fragile form of a woman, thin, bruised, and barely alive. Dark hair clung to her cheek, tangled with mud, and her breathing was so shallow Lydia feared it might vanish if she spoke too loudly. The bruises across her face and arms painted a story of violence that neither child fully understood, but instinctively feared. Then the baby's cry rose again, hoarse, desperate, almost pleading. Wrapped in a blanket far too thin for the autumn chill, his lips quivered with cold. His tiny fists shook in the air as though grasping for warmth that wasn't there. Clara pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "Lydia, what do we do?" Lydia swallowed hard. Fear clawed at her throat, but she knew she couldn't turn away. "We help," she whispered, her voice unsteady yet carrying a strength beyond her years. She knelt beside the infant, tucking the edges of the blanket tighter around his fragile body. "It's okay. We're here now," she murmured, though the words were as much to calm herself as the child. Thor moved into position, his body forming, a living shield between the strangers and the open field. His amber eyes scanned every shadow, every rustle of corn, as if he alone carried the vow that no harm would cross into this small circle. His growl was low, protective, a promise made, without words. Lydia unclipped the small canteen from her belt, remembering her mother's instructions. "Not too much water if someone's hurt," she whispered, almost to herself. She dampened the corner of her bandana and gently touched it to the woman's cracked lips. For a moment, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, pain clouding her gaze. She tried to speak, her lips trembling, and with a desperate breath she managed to whisper, "Please, save my baby." Then her strength left her, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Clara's composure broke. I'll get Mom," she stammered, and without another word, she turned and sprinted down the tractor path, her braids whipping behind her, boots thudding on the earth. Lydia stayed, her hands pressed lightly against the infant's chest. feeling each fragile rise and fall. "You'll be okay," she murmured, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. Thor edged closer, sniffing the child's face, before returning to his guard unyielding. Back at the farmhouse, Martha Hart had just set her coffee down when the door burst open. Clara stood there breathless, cheeks flushed, eyes brimming with panic. "Mom! A woman! She's hurt and there's a baby! Thor's with them! Please, hurry!" Martha didn't ask questions. Years of hardship had taught her that action came. First, panic later. Grabbing her jacket and phone, she followed Clara, her boots pounding the earth as her mind raced. Who could this woman be? How long had she lain there? How could a baby survive the night in such cold? When they reached the ditch, the sight stopped Martha's breath. There was Lydia, kneeling protectively over the infant, Thor rigid and watchful, at her side. The woman's battered face, framed by weeds and mud, struck something deep in Martha. Memories of nights she herself had felt the crushing weight of loneliness when her husband was away, and she had fought to keep food on the table for her girls. She knew the look of someone carrying more pain than one soul should. Kneeling down, Martha checked the woman's pulse. Faint, but still there. She touched the baby's cheek. Cold, but alive. Without hesitation, she stripped off her jacket and wrapped it around the child, layering it over the thin blanket. "Good work, Lydia," she said softly, her voice trembling with both pride and worry. Thor allowed Martha closer, though his muscles stayed tense, eyes sharp against every sound. From the field. Pulling out her phone, Martha dialed quickly. 911, what's your emergency?" came the voice. Martha steadied herself. "We have an unconscious woman, battered and malnourished. An infant, about 5 months old, weak and dehydrated. Location is County Road 6, near the cornfield ditch. We need an ambulance immediately." "Help is on the way," the dispatcher assured. "Keep the infant warm. Do not attempt to move the woman unless necessary. Can you stay on the line?" "I can," Martha said, placing the phone on speaker so her daughters could hear the calm voice guiding them. She looked at her girls, their young faces etched with fear, yet holding fast to bravery. "You did the right thing," she told them, firmly, her voice carrying both comfort and command. The baby's cries softened into hiccuping whimpers as Lydia adjusted the blanket and whispered words of comfort. Clara clung to her mother's sleeve, drawing strength from her touch. Thor finally lowered himself to the ground, paws crossed, amber eyes unblinking on the brush. He seemed to declare with his stillness, "No one will touch them unless I allow it." And so they waited, the small family and their loyal dog holding vigil at the ditch. The morning sun stretched higher, its light spilling long shadows across the corn. In that fragile pocket of time, a circle of protection formed, mother, daughters, and a dog guarding two strangers whose lives hung by a thread. Silence lingered, broken only by the dispatcher's calm voice and the baby's faint whimper. Even the valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then, at last, the rising wail of sirens cut across the quiet of Autumn Valley. The wail of the ambulance siren split the morning calm of Autumn Valley as it raced along County Road 6, carrying within it two fragile lives and the anxious hush of the Hart family who had discovered them. Lydia and Clara sat side by side in the back, their small hands clutched tightly together, eyes darting between the baby wrapped in warming blankets and the silent, battered woman strapped to the gurney. Thor had been allowed to ride along, a rare exception made by the paramedics after witnessing how the dog had refused to leave the baby side. He sat firmly near the rear door, chest broad, head raised, his amber eyes locked forward as if memorizing every sound the vehicle made. When the ambulance screeched to a halt at Autumn Valley General Hospital, the emergency doors slid open, spilling out paramedics with urgency honed by years of practice. The woman was rushed in first. She looked no older than 27, her face gaunt and hollowed, lips pale, as if color had long ago abandoned them. Her name, gleaned only from a crumpled ID card tucked into the corner of her torn purse, was Rachel Donovan. Rachel was placed under the bright lights of the trauma bay, the doctors muttering clipped phrases: malnourished, possible anemia, contusions, multiple stages of healing. Wires and monitors soon surrounded her frail body. For the nurses, it was routine. For Martha, watching through the glass, it was a jarring reminder of what long-suffering could do to a human being. Meanwhile, baby Noah was transferred to the pediatric unit. A nurse named Elena Myers, in her early 30s with cropped sandy hair and quick, nimble movements, handled him with a steadiness that reassured the Heart girls. Elena mixed a bottle of formula with practice care, then lifted the infant against her shoulder, coaxing his mouth to the rubber nipple. At first his cry sputtered in protest, but hunger won out, and soon the thin sound of sucking filled the room. Each gulp was a small miracle. His breathing steadied, his cheeks softened from blue tinge to a healthier pink. Clara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Martha placed a comforting hand on each daughter's shoulder. "He's going to be all right," she whispered. Her own voice shook, though she tried to mask it. "You did good, girls." Hours passed under the fluorescent hum of the hospital. The twins wandered between waiting chairs and Rachel's room. There, nervous energy burning itself into small gestures, tidying magazines on the counter, whispering to Thor, sketching in the corners of Lydia's notebook. Thor had stationed himself outside Rachel's room like a living sentinel. Every staff member who passed gave the animal a sideways glance. He did not snarl, did not bark. He simply watched, still a stone, ears flicking only when footsteps approached. Strangely, his presence eased rather than troubled most. Several nurses remarked they felt safer with him there, as though his gaze alone could filter out trouble. By late afternoon, Rachel stirred. Her eyelids fluttered against the sterile light before cracking open. Confusion clouded her eyes. Then, fear? Her gaze darted wildly around the room, breath quickening, hands clutching at the thin blanket over her. Martha stepped closer, voice gentle. "It's all right. You're safe now. You're at the hospital in Autumn Valley." At the mention of safety, Rachel's face crumpled. Tears spilled fast and unrestrained. She tried to speak, but her voice broke into fragments, words swallowed by sobs. "My baby, he's here," Martha reassured, gesturing to the glass window where Noah now slept under watchful machines. "He's being cared for. He's going to be okay." Rachel turned her face into her pillow, shoulders heaving. She cried silently for several minutes, her grief sounding older than her 27 years. The twins stood just inside the doorway, hesitant, but tunable to look away. Lydia bit her lip, wanting to speak, but not knowing how. Clara, more tender, rummaged in her small satchel and pulled out a piece of paper and colored pencils she always carried. She sat against the wall, quietly sketching. Lines took shape. 2 girls. A baby bundled in blankets, and Thor standing tall, his tail curved protectively. When she finished, she patted over and placed it on Rachel's bedside table. "This is us," Clara said softly. "We're here too." Rachel's swollen eyes flickered toward the drawing. For a moment, fear retreated. Her hand, trembling, reached to touch the crayon lines. A fragile sob escaped her, softer now, almost disbelief. She nodded once in thanks, though no words formed. Not long after, another figure entered the hospital. Sheriff Ethan Grayson, the long Irving lawman of Autumn Valley, cut a tall, broad silhouette in his worn tan uniform. In his early 50s, his once black hair had faded to iron gray, cropped neatly above a face lined by seasons of weather and worry. Ethan was not a man given to dramatics. His strength lay in patience, in listening more than speaking, and eyeing a deep sense of responsibility to his town. He introduced himself to Martha with a polite nod, then crouched briefly to acknowledge Thor, who met his gaze evenly, tail giving one solemn thump. Ethan had known the dog from previous farm visits. He understood Thor's presence here was more than coincidence. "What do we know about her?" Ethan asked quietly, glancing toward Rachel's room. "Not much yet," Martha replied. "They found an ID, Rachel Donovan. That's all." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "The injuries, the malnutrition. This doesn't look like someone who just fell on hard times. I suspect abuse. We'll run a background check, see if Agnon reported her missing." He stepped aside to speak with the attending physician, taking notes. In a small leather-bound book, his questions were precise, measured. How old are the bruises? Any signs of restraints? Could the malnourishment be prolonged? He wrote without embellishment, his pen scratching like a quiet metronome. His mind was already turning toward possible suspects, the pattern all too familiar from years of service. Meanwhile, the Hart twins remained near Rachel's bedside. Lydia tried to coax a smile from her by recounting small farm stories. How Thor once herded the neighbors' cows into the wrong pen. How Clara named every pumpkin in their patch. Rachel listened but spoke little, her silence heavy with pain. Yet when Clara's drawing caught her eye again, she pressed it against her chest, as though it were a fragile promise she couldn't afford to lose. The hospital grew quieter as evening crept in. Noah slept peacefully under the soft glow of the pediatric unit, his breath now steady and sure. Rachel drifted between wakefulness and sleep, tears drying on her cheeks. Martha stood by the window, watching both mother and child with a mixture of sorrow and determination. She knew this was only the beginning of a longer story, but for now, survival was enough. Sheriff Ethan closed his notebook, his face thoughtful. "I'll need to talk to her when she's stronger," he said. "But I'll tell you this much. People don't just show up beaten, starving, and with a baby unless something dark is behind it. We'll get to the bottom of it." Thor shifted against the floor, ears rising as footsteps echoed down the corridor. He didn't relax until the sound faded away. For everyone who looked at him that night, the nurses, the sheriff, even Martha, it felt as though the dog already knew more than any of them. He sat still and vigilant, eyes on the door to Rachel's room, carrying the unspoken vow that nothing would harm her or the child again. Not while he was there. The pale light of morning slanted through the blinds of Autumn Valley General Hospital, striping the white walls with uneven bars of gold. Rachel Donovan sat upright in her bed, a thin blanket draped around her shoulders. Her face still bore the fading purples and yellows of bruises, but her eyes, though tired, carried a flicker of determination they had not shown the day before. Beside her, Noah slept in a plastic bassinet wheeled close to her bed. His breath came, evenly now, tiny chest rising and falling as though the world had finally decided to grant him peace. Martha stood near the window, her daughters perched on the sill, coloring quietly. Thor was stretched across the doorway, his massive head resting on his paws, amber eyes tracking every shadow that passed in the hall. It was Sheriff Ethan Grayson, who sat closest to Rachel. His broad shoulders filled the simple hospital chair, his gray hair cropped neatly, his uniform smelling faintly of leather and the outdoors. He leaned forward with calm patience, notebook open in his lap, pen ready but unused. Ethan was a man who knew when silence spoke louder than questions. Rachel's voice was hesitant at first, soft, as though honest to forming truths aloud. "His name is Caleb Moore," she whispered, fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "I met him when I was barely 20. He was charming then, kind even. He said I was everything he'd ever wanted, but it changed slowly at first and then all at once." Her words grew steadier as they poured out, though her eyes remained lowered. Caleb controlled everything. What I ate, who I spoke to, when I could leave the house. I wasn't allowed to see my family. He'd take the car keys, cut the phone line. When he went out, at first he just shouted, "Broke dishes." Later, his hands became the punishment. She swallowed hard, tears pooling, but not falling. When Noah was born, I thought maybe he'd soften. Instead, it made him worse. Him. He said the baby was too loud, too needy. Every time Noah cried, Caleb would he'd hurt me to shut us both up. The twins had fallen silent, their coloring forgotten. Martha gently ushered them into the hallway with a soft promise of hot cocoa from the cafeteria. When the door shut, Rachel's shoulders collapsed inward, no longer holding themselves upright for the sake of children's ears. "I tried to leave before," she continued, voice ragged. "Every time he dragged me back. But last week after he struck me with a bottle, Noah screamed and I thought Caleb might." Her words broke apart. She pressed a fist against her mouth, inhaling until she could continue. "That night, I waited until he passed out. I wrapped Noah in a blanket, slipped out the back. I walked for miles. I don't even know how many. We had no food, no water. I just kept moving. I thought if I could reach anywhere, anyone maybe." Her voice trailed. "I didn't expect to survive." Ethan finally wrote, his pen moving in clean strokes. His eyes softened, though his jaw was set. "You did survive," he said simply. "You made sure Noah did too. That matters." Rachel glanced at him, surprised at the lack of judgment in his tone. "Do you believe me?" "Every word," Ethan replied, closing the notebook. "Because I've seen his kind before." Later that afternoon, Ethan retreated to his office in the modest brick building that housed the Autumn Valley Sheriff's Department. Files littered his desk, coffee cooled in a chipped mug, and Thor sat near the corner as though he belonged there. Ethan typed Caleb Moore's name into the federal database. Within moments, a flood of records filled the screen. Caleb Moore, age 32. Prior arrests, domestic assault, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. One conviction 3 years earlier for aggravated battery against a partner. Rachel sentenced 2 years suspended. Probation with mandatory counseling. Notes in red ink told the rest. Non-compliance, missed mandatory sessions, declared high-risk offender, warrant issued 6 months ago for probation violation, current status, fugitive, whereabouts unknown. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He had seen men like Caleb. Dangerous not only for what they did, but for how well they hid beneath charm until the mask slipped. "So you ran and he ran too," Ethan muttered more to himself than to Thor. The dog tilted his head, ears pry-cricked as though he understood. Determined to follow the scent, Ethan began canvassing the outer edges of town. He visited motel, trailer parks, and cheap rental units. Places Amin on the run might disappear without drawing notice. Thor accompanied him, riding in the back of the patrol SUV, gaze fixed out the window with soldier-like discipline. At the third stop, a sagging 2-story boarding house at the edge of the highway. Thor stiffened before Ethan had even parked. His hackles rose, nose pressed against the window, chest vibrating with a low growl. Ethan climbed out, leash clipped, and gave the single-word command, "Search!" Thor moved low and deliberate, sniffing along the cracked walkway, pausing at the base of the stairwell. He barked once, sharp, decisive. Ethan followed, eyes narrowing. There, tucked into the corner by the door frame, was a crushed cigarette butt and an empty energy drink can. On the rim, faint indentations of teeth. Ethan bagged both items with gloved hands, his instincts whispering the confirmation his dog had already given. Caleb Moore had been here. Inside, the landlord, a balding man in a stained undershirt, insisted no one named Moore had rented a room, but he grew nervous under Ethan's steady stare. Couple weeks ago, maybe there was a guy, dark hair, rough-looking, paid cash, left quick, didn't say his name, Ethan didn't push harder. He didn't need to. The truth was already tightening around them. He returned to the SUV, Thor jumping inside smoothly, tail flicking once in victory. "Good boy," Ethan murmured, scratching behind his ears. The dog leaned into the touch but kept his eyes on the road ahead, as though already tracking the next move. That evening, Ethan filed an official report. Caleb Moore wasn't just a missing name on paper. He was close, circling Autumn Valley like a storm cloud, yet to break. Rachel's story was no longer just one woman's pain. It was evidence. It was warning. And now Ethan knew the fight to protect her and Noah had only begun. Back at the hospital, Rachel cradled Noah against her chest, whispering lullabies so faint they barely reached the boy's ears. Clara's drawing lay pinned to the wall beside her bed, a small splash of color in a sterile room. For the first time in years, Rachel allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the truth she had buried to survive could finally be spoken, and that speaking it might bring her freedom. Autumn Valley had always prided itself on being a quiet town. By the time the autumn leaves turned rust red and clung stubbornly to their branches, most people knew their neighbors by name, and strangers stood out the way smoke stands out against a clean sky. That was why the first whispers unsettled Sheriff Ethan Grayson as soon as he heard them. A tall man with a rough look had been spotted near the gas station off Main Street asking questions about the hospital. The description was vague, dark hair, lean build, restless eyes, but it was enough to set Ethan on edge. Rachel Donovan's story had begun to slip beyond the sterile walls of Autumn Valley General. News spread in small towns, faster than wind through the cornfields. And though the hospital staff tried to keep patient matters private, it took only one overheard conversation for rumors to scatter. By the second day, someone outside knew Rachel had survived, and by the third, a stranger was seen loitering near the hospital parking lot. Rachel was seated by the window of her room when she saw him. The figure was partially obscured by shadows in distance, but her body reacted before her mind caught up. Her chest tightened, breath hitched, and her hands clutched Noah's blanket so hard her knuckles widened. For a fleeting second, she thought she might faint. The man leaned casually against a lamppost, but to Rachel, his silhouette screamed familiarity. Caleb, she could feel it in her bones, the way one feels an old injury aching before the rain. She pressed the call button for the nurse with trembling fingers. When Nurse Elena Myers entered, sandy-haired, brisk, and calm, Rachel could barely force the words out. "He's here," she rayed, her voice breaking. "Outside, he found me." Elena glanced through the blinds but saw only ordinary shapes in the fading daylight. Still, she trusted Rachel's terror more than her own sight. Within minutes, Sheriff Ethan was called. Ethan arrived wearing the same sturdy uniform and steady expression that rarely faltered. But as Rachel stammered her description, he caught the subtle change in her voice, the pitch of someone who wasn't mistaking shadows. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, grounding her like a tree root. "We'll keep you safe," he said, the firmness in his tone leaving no space for doubt. That night, Ethan implemented 24-hour protective detail around Rachel's room. A deputy was stationed at each end of the corridor. Surveillance cameras were checked twice and visitor access restricted. Even so, Rachel's sleep remained fractured. Every groan of the hospital's old pipes, every shuffle of shoes in the hallway jolted her awake. She clutched Noah against her chest as if her arms alone could ward off the pass. Thor became her truest guard. With the nurse's reluctant approval, he was allowed to lie directly outside her door. His ears remained pricked through the night. His body taut as a bowering whenever footsteps approached. More than once his sharp bark sent a wandering orderly stumbling back in surprise. Lydia and Clara, watching, believed with all their hearts that nothing evil could cross the threshold while Thor kept vigil. Daylight softened the hospital's edges, but Rachel's fear lingered. The Harts, sensing it, tried to bring warmth into the room. Lydia and Clara begged their mother to fetch some of their favorite children's books from home. Martha returned the next morning with a canvas tote full of dog-eared paperbacks and slim, hard covers, each one carrying the faint smell of the farmhouse where the girls had grown up. The twins climbed into chairs near Rachel's bed, opening the first book with ceremonious importance. Lydia read aloud in her bold, clear voice, stumbling only occasionally on larger words. Clara leaned closer to show Noah the pictures, tracing bright illustrations of animals and stars with her small fingers. At first, Rachel sat stiff, hands locked together, as though she feared they might betray her by shaking. But slowly, the rhythm of the story filled the sterile air. The sound of children's voices carried a gentleness she had not heard in years. Noah wriggled, then sighed into a soft sleep, his lips still damp from his morning bottle. Rachel's eyes lingered on his tiny chest, rising and falling, and for the first time since her ordeal, she smiled. It was faint, fragile as glass, but it was there. Her hand reached to brush Noah's cheek, and the expression stayed, even when tears pulled again in her eyes. Sheriff Ethan returned in the evening to check on her. He found Rachel calmer than before, sitting with Clara's drawing pinned proudly above her bed and a new book resting open in her lap. "They read to me," she told him, her voice raw but steadier. "I almost forgot what safe sounds like." Ethan nodded. "We'll keep it that way." Yet, even as he spoke, his gaze shifted to the window. The parking lot beyond was quiet, but quiet had a way of holding secrets. He made a mental note to double the night patrols. As the corridor dimmed with evening lights, Thor shifted Aegon into position at Rachel's door. His deep chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths, but his eyes never fully closed. Nurses passed and smiled softly at the sight of the great dog stretched like a wall between danger and the fragile hope that had just begun to rebuild itself inside the room. For Martha and her daughters, Rachel's smile was proof enough that their small gestures mattered. For Ethan, it was a reminder that safety was never guaranteed, only guarded with vigilance. And for Rachel, it was the beginning of rediscovering a life not defined by fear. Though she knew the shadow outside had not vanished, it waited. The hospital was quieter than a church past midnight. The fluorescent lights hummed above the empty corridor, stretching shadows across the sterile linoleum. Most patients were asleep, and the rhythm of heart monitors pulsed faintly behind closed doors. At the end of the pediatric wing, Rachel Donovan lay awake, listening to Noah's shallow breaths in the crib beside her bed. Every creak of the old pipes set her heart racing, each draft against the window stirring the fear that the shadow outside had returned. Thor lay stretched across the threshold of the room, ears pricked, his body a wall of muscle and vigilance. His breathing was steady, but his amber eyes scanned the dim hall as if waiting for something to break the fragile stillness. Martha and the twins had stayed late into the evening before finally retreating to the family waiting lounge, curled together beneath thin hospital blankets. Ethan had reassured them the deputies on watch would keep danger at bay, but danger has its own way of slipping past guards. Shortly after 2 hours in the morning, a figure moved through the side entrance of Autumn Valley General. The cameras caught only a glimpse. A man in a dark hood, shoulder-stout, stride purposeful. He avoided the main reception desk, climbing the stairwell 2 steps at a time. He knew where he was going. Caleb Moore had found them. He smelled faintly of stale smoke and sweat, his stubble thick and uneven across his jaw. Rage had hollowed his face, eyes bloodshot with sleepless obsession. In his pocket, a rusted switchblade tapped against his thigh, a habit he'd carried from darker days. His breathing was heavy, but controlled. This was not a man acting blindly. It was a predator hunting the prey he believed belonged to him. The first to sense him was Thor. His ears twitched, head snapping up toward the hall long before footsteps became audible. His low growl rumbled. Through the quiet, a sound primal and unmistakable. Then came the explosion of sound, one sharp, thunderous bark that shook the walls. Down the corridor, Lydia and Clara startled awake in their makeshift beds. Lydia bolted upright, clutching her sister's arm. "Thor!" she whispered, panic filling her voice. Clara buried her face against Lydia's shoulder, trembling. "What's happening?" Thor's barks grew sharper, urgent. Rachel jolted up, pulling Noah against her chest. Her heart seized when she glimpsed a figure at the far end of the corridor, the unmistakable outline of Caleb. "Stay away!" Rachel cried, her voice cracking. Caleb's lips curled into a sneer as he advanced, his boots heavy against the floor. "You think you can hide from me? You and that brat belong with me? Always have." Thor lunged forward, hackles raised, his body vibrating with restrained fury. Rachel backed toward the corner, shielding Noah with her trembling arms. Her entire frame shook. But her eyes locked on her son with a mother's ferocity. The sound of boots pounding against the stairs cut through the chaos. Ethan and two deputies summoned by Thor's alarm. Ethan's presence filled the hallway, his tall figure commanding in the dim light, gun drawn but steady. Caleb Moore. Step back now. Caleb snarled like a cornered animal and bolted down the opposite end of the hall. The deputies sprinted after him, radios crackling urgent commands. The chase crashed through the sterile silence, echoing across empty walls. Ethan moved swiftly, calling over his shoulder, "Keep the women and kids safe." But Caleb was fast, driven by fury. He doubled back suddenly, shoving a laundry cart to the floor. It crashed, scattering sheets across the linoleum. One deputy slipped but regained his footing. Caleb charged toward Rachel's room, switchblade glinting under fluorescent light. Thor needed no command. With a thunderous snarl, he launched himself forward, his jaws clamped around Caleb's forearm, teeth sinking through fabric into flesh. Caleb screamed, in rage and pain, thrashing violently. But Thor held on, his entire body weight dragging the man backward. The knife clattered to the floor, spinning harmlessly away. Ethan seized the moment. He tackled Caleb hard against the wall, pinning him. With years of honed strength. The deputies rushed in, wrenching Caleb's free arm behind his back, steel cuffs snapping closed with finality. Caleb roared, but the sound was more desperation than power now. His fight drained beneath the unyielding weight of justice and the jaws of the dog that refused to let him near his victims. Rachel collapsed to her knees. Noah pressed tightly against her chest. Tears streamed unchecked down her face as she sobbed into her baby's hair. For a moment, the hospital room was filled not with fear, but with the raw relief of survival. In the waiting lounge, Lydia and Clara clung to each other as Martha rushed to their side. "Are you all right?" she whispered, smoothing hair from their damp foreheads. They nodded shakily, eyes wide. Through the glass window they had seen enough. The flash of steel, the crash of bodies, the fearless dog holding the line. For the first time, they understood that heroes did not only live inside storybooks. Heroes had fur-and sharp teeth, or uniforms and steady voices. Heroes were the ones who stood in front of danger so others could breathe. Lydia's voice was small, but sure as she whispered to her sister, "Thor is our knight." Clara nodded, gripping her hand tighter. When the chaos settled, Ethan approached Rachel's bedside. His gray eyes softened. "He won't hurt you again," he said. "You have my word." Rachel's sobs broke anew, but this time they carried gratitude. She reached for Martha's hand, clutching it desperately. "Thank you for calling, for not turning away, and your girls. They saved us." Martha's eyes glistened as she drew Rachel and Noah close. No one deserves what you've endured. You're safe now. That's all that matters." In the hall, Thor finally released his grip, panning heavily, his muzzle damp with exertion. One of the deputies knelt to stroke his head, murmuring, "Good boy! Good, brave boy!" Thor leaned into the touch, only briefly before returning to his station at Rachel's door, as if to remind them that his duty was not yet finished. The courthouse of Autumn Valley was not a grand building, just a sturdy brick structure that had stood for nearly a century on the corner of Main Street. Its clock tower, weathered by storms, ticked steadily over the gathered crowd the morning Caleb Moore was brought to trial. The town had never been this alive with whispers. Farmers left their fields for the day, shopkeepers closed early, and townsfolk pressed into the oak panel courtroom, their faces drawn tight with anticipation. Rachel sat near the front, Noah cradled against her shoulder, her frame wrapped in a simple navy dress that Martha had helped her find. Her cheeks were fuller now than when she had first been discovered by the Harts, but faint shadows of old bruises still ghosted her skin. She held her son close, a steady rhythm of breath grounding her as she waited for the gavel's call. Martha sat on one side of her, hand firm over hers, while Lydia and Clara sat on the other, their small eyes darting between Rachel and Thor, who lay loyally at their feet. Caleb was led in, shackles clinking. His once arrogant stride had collapsed into a slouch, his unshaven jaw revealing the weeks of custody. His dark eyes, though, still glimmered with anger. He scanned the room as though searching for someone to intimidate, but the weight of so many gazes staring back left him muted. The judge presiding was Harold Whitaker, a man in his 60s with a reputation for blunt fairness. His hair had thinned to a silvery crown, and his deep voice carried easily across the chamber. "We are here today to deliberate on the charges against Caleb Moore," he announced. "Counts of domestic abuse, unlawful restraint, child endangerment, and unlawful entry." One by one, evidence was presented. Photographs of Rachel's injuries, testimony from doctors detailing malnutrition and repeated trauma. Ethan Grayson himself took the stand, recounting the night Caleb had broken into the hospital and the courage of the German shepherd who had held the man back long enough for deputies to disarm him. The deputies testified, too, their voices steady, recounting how Thor's intervention had saved both Rachel and Noah from certain harm. Caleb's lawyer, a wiry man named Dalton Pierce, attempted to argue for leniency, claiming Caleb suffered from stress and that his actions were misguided attempts to protect his family. But every word fell flat under the weight of Rachel's trembling voice when she finally rose to speak. Her hands shook, but she lifted her chin. "For years, I lived in fear. Fear of his voice, fear of his hands, fear of what he would do to my son. I stayed silent because I thought silence was survival. But survival came only when I ran. And when I fell, stranger saved me. Martha and her girls, Sheriff Grayson and Thor. Caleb does not deserve leniency. He deserves accountability. Not for me alone, but for every woman who fears speaking." The courtroom fell silent. Even Dalton Pierce lowered his gaze. Judge Whitaker's gavel came down like thunder. "Caleb Moore, in light of overwhelming evidence and testimony, this court sentences you to 15 years in state prison without parole for the first 10. May this serve both as punishment and a warning." A collective sigh rippled through the courtroom. Relief, vindication. Rachel's knees weakened, but Martha steadied her while Lydia whispered to Clara, "He can't hurt them anymore." Thor gave a single bark as if affirming what everyone already knew. Weeks later, Autumn Valley celebrated not with parades, but with quiet acknowledgments. Rachel, after her release from the hospital, chose not to leave town. Instead, she moved into Amethyst Guest House on the Hart Farm, where the sound of roosters replaced the echoes of fear. She took to helping Martha with chores, feeding hens, carrying baskets of vegetables, and began taking lessons from an elderly seamstress in town named Edna Harper, a wiry woman with snowy curls and quick, nimble hands. Edna, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, insisted Rachel had a talent for stitching. "A steady hand, even with tremors," she said, eyes twinkling. "That's strength, not weakness." Rachel threw herself into the craft, imagining a future where she could support Noah with honest, steady work. Thor's role in the rescue did not go unnoticed. At a town gathering in front of the courthouse, Sheriff Ethan presented him with a medal engraved K9 Honor of Valor. Children clapped, townsfolk cheered, and Thor accepted Themdel with quiet dignity, tails swishing once as if embarrassed by the attention. To the children of Autumn Valley, he became more than a dog. He was the guardian they believed in, the hero they whispered about at bedtime. For Lydia and Clara, the experience reshaped their understanding of bravery. Neighbors patted their heads, praising their courage, but the girls carried something deeper than pride. They had watched real danger, felt fear in their bones, and seen how compassion and action could change everything. They no longer thought heroes belonged only in the fairy tales they read aloud to Rachel. They had lived beside them, one in a sheriff's uniform, another cloaked in scars of survival, and one with paws and teeth who never wavered. One crisp autumn morning, weeks after the trial, Rachel stood at the edge of the Hart Farms field. The sun cresting low over the hills, Noah, now stronger, giggled as he crawled. Clumsily on a quilt Lydia had spread out. Clara sat nearby, showing him bright wooden blocks, her voice carrying a patient kindness. Thor lay close, head resting on his paws, watching every movement as though Noah's laughter was the most sacred sound on earth. Rachel's eyes filled as she watched the scene. The world was still imperfect. Her past could not be erased. But in that moment, with the air smelling of earth and hay, she felt something pure. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were not of grief. "They were of gratitude," she whispered, her voice trembling yet steady. "You've given me back the meaning of life." Martha, standing behind her with a basket of corn, heard and smiled softly. "Sometimes hope is planted," she said, "and sometimes it grows when we least expect it." The heart form that morning glowed brighter than the sun itself. Justice had been served, and in its place, new beginnings had taken root. Sometimes what looks like coincidence is nothing less than a quiet miracle from God. A broken woman found. In a field, a child rescued from the edge of despair, and a faithful dog standing guard when darkness tried to return. These are reminders that even in our ordinary days, heaven still moves among us. In every struggle, there can be redemption. In every scar, there can be healing. And in every act of courage, whether from a loyal animal, a brave child, or a kind neighbor, there is the touch of God's hand guiding us back to hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that miracles still happen. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. And may God bless you and your loved ones with peace and protection each